Non-Christian testimony from the authentic pen of lying Christian scribes. Josephus, 37 to 100 AD. Flavius Josephus is a highly respected and much quoted Romano-Jewish historian. The early Christians were zealous readers of his work. A native of Judea, living in the 1st century AD, Josephus was actually governor of Galilee for a time prior to the War of 70 AD, the very province in which Jesus allegedly did his wonders. Though not born until 37 AD, and therefore not a contemporary witness to any Jesus character, Josephus at one point even lived in Cana, the very city in which Christ is said to have wrought his first miracle. Josephus's two major tomes are History of the Jewish War and The Antiquity of the Jews. In these complementary works, the former written in the 70s, the latter in the 90s, Josephus mentions every noted personage of Palestine and describes every important event which occurred there during the first 70 years of the Christian era. At face value, Josephus appears to be the answer to a Christian apologist's dreams, the Testimonium Flavianum. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of the Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Josephus ben Matthias, The Antiquity of the Jews, Book 18:3. In this single paragraph, Josephus confirms every salient aspect of the Christ myth. 1. Jesus' existence. 2. His more than human status. 3. His miracle working. 4. His teaching. 5. His ministry among the Jews and the Gentiles. 6. His messiahship. 7. His condemnation by the Jewish priests. 8. His sentence by Pilate. 9. His death on the cross. 10. The devotion of his followers. 11. His resurrection on the third day. 12. His post-death appearance. 13. His fulfillment of divine prophecy. 14. The successful continuance of the Christians. In just 127 words, Josephus confirms everything. Now that is a miracle. But wait a minute. Not a single writer before the 4th century, not Justin, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Cyprian, etc., in all their defences against pagan hostility, makes a single reference to Josephus's wondrous words. 3rd century church father, Origen, for example, spent half his life and 250,000 words contending against the pagan writer Celsus. Origen drew on all sorts of proofs and witnesses to his arguments in his fierce defence of Christianity. He quotes from Josephus extensively, yet even he makes no reference to this golden paragraph from Josephus, which would have been the ultimate rebuttal. In fact, Origen actually said that Josephus was not believing in Jesus the Christ. Origen did not quote the golden paragraph because this paragraph had not yet been written. It was absent from early copies of the works of Josephus and did not appear in Origen's 3rd century version of Josephus, referenced in his Contra Keltum. Consider also the anomalies. How could Josephus claim that Jesus had been the answer to his messianic hopes, yet remain an Orthodox Jew? The absurdity forces some apologists to make ridiculous claims that Josephus was a closet Christian. 2. If Josephus really thought Jesus had been the Christ, surely he would have added more about him than one paragraph, a casual aside in someone else's, that is Pilate's, story. In fact, Josephus relates much more about John the Baptist than about Jesus. He also reports in great detail the antics of other self-proclaimed messiahs, including Judas of Galilee, Theudas the magician, and the unnamed Egyptian Jew messiah. It is striking that Josephus confirms everything that Christians could wish for, but he adds nothing not in the gospel narratives, nothing that would have been unknown by Christians already. 3. The passage is out of context. Book 18 starts with the Roman taxation under Quirinius in 6 AD, talks about various Jewish sects at the time, including the Essenes and a sect Judas the Galilean. He discusses Herod's building of various cities, the succession of priests and procurators, and so on. Chapter 3 starts with a sedition against Pilate, who planned to slaughter all the Jews but changed his mind. Pilate then used sacred money to supply water to Jerusalem, and the Jews protested. Pilate sent spies among the Jews with concealed weapons, and there was a great massacre. Then comes the paragraph about Jesus, and immediately after it Josephus continues, about the same time another terrible misfortune confounded the Jews. Josephus, an Orthodox Jew, would not have thought the Christian story to be another terrible fortune. It is only a Christian who would have considered this to be a Jewish tragedy. Paragraph 3 can be lifted out of the text and with no damage to the chapter. It flows better without it. Outside of this tiny paragraph, in all Josephus's voluminous works, there is not a single reference to Christianity anywhere. 4. The phrase "to this day" confirms that this is a later interpolation. There was no tribe of Christians during Josephus's time. Christianity did not get off the ground until the 2nd century. 5. The hyperbolic language is uncharacteristic of the historian. As the divine prophets have foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. This is the stuff of Christian propaganda. Reality check. In fact, the Josephus paragraph about Jesus does not appear until the beginning of the 4th century, at the time of Constantine. Bishop Eusebius, the great church propagandist and self-confessed liar for God, was the first person known to have quoted this paragraph of Josephus about the year 340. This was after the Christians had become the custodians of religious correctness. Whole libraries of antiquity were torched by the Christians, yet unlike the works of other Jewish contemporaries, the histories of Josephus survived. They survived because the Christian censors had a use for them. They planted evidence of Josephus, turning the leading Jewish historian of his day into a witness for Jesus Christ. Finding no references to Jesus anywhere in his genuine work, they interpolated a brief but all-embracing reference based purely on Christian belief. The Catholic Encyclopedia is obliged to admit the passage seems to suffer from repeated interpolations. Do we need to look any further to identify Eusebius himself as the forger? Sanctioned by the imperial propagandists, every Christian commentator for the next 13 centuries accepted unquestionably the entire Testimonium Flavianum, along with its declaration that Jesus was the Messiah. And even into the 21st century, scholars who should know better trot out a truncated version of the golden paragraph in a scurrilous attempt to keep Josephus on message. The Arabic Josephus. In a novel embellishment to the notion of an Orthodox Jew giving testimony of Jesus, defenders of the faith have in recent times tossed an Arabic version of the Josephus text on to their pile of dubious evidence. The Arabic recension was brought to light in 1971 by Professor Shlomo Pines of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Pines himself remained cautious about claims of untempered authenticity, but the brethren had no such reservations. Such is their desperation to keep Josephus in the witness stand for Jesus. The work in question is actually a history of the world to the year 942, penned by an Arab Christian bishop, Agapius of Heli. The world history preserves in Arabic translation a version of the Testimonium minus the most obvious Christian interpolations. But what does a 10th century copy actually prove? Claims that the Arabic passage itself dates from the 4th century are untenable. Written Arabic barely existed at such an early date. Moreover, Agapius was a Melkite Christian, that is, pro-Byzantium, at a time of intensified Islamization of his native Syria. What he wrote was political correctness for his own times. A new Shia Hamadi dynasty had been established barely 50 miles away in Aleppo. Its first prince, Saif ad-Dawla, sword of the state, began a century of persistent attacks against Byzantium. Agapius' paraphrase of a Syrian rendition of Josephus from a Greek original rather significantly mentions JC's condemnation to die, but not the actuality of it, and of JC being alive 3 days later, in other words, a carefully balanced compatibility with Muhammad's view of a Jesus as a prophet who did not die on the cross. In short, the Arabic Josephus is no evidence of the Christian God-man and serves only to confuse the unwary. The usual suspects. There is no doubt that Christians existed from the early years of the 2nd century, certainly, and as heretical Jews and under diverse names up to a generation earlier. Belief in a Messiah, a Christ in Greek, was endemic among Jews after all. Christian apologists, for their own convenience, blur the distinction between evidence of Jesus and evidence of Christians. It is rather as if a child who believed in a tooth fairy was to be presented as evidence that the tooth fairy really existed. But belief in a celestial Christ does not equate to belief in a flesh and blood Jesus of Nazareth. And when the heretical and Gnostic views of early Christians are examined, Jesus of Nazareth is noticeably absent. And to press the point, even a belief in Jesus of Nazareth does not make him a reality. It's only the belief that is a reality. None abashed, the Christian apologists compound their suspect logic by recruiting notable pagans as witnesses, writers who were doing their best to faithfully report on a suspect cult. And as ever in the history of Christianity, in the hands of its scribes, forgery augments what the ancient writers actually wrote, the better to bring believers to the one true faith. The Jamesian reference. Because the Testimonium is so readily exposed as a forgery, Christian apologists turn increasingly to a much briefer reference in Book 20. To quote, Festus was now dead and Albinus was put upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Josephus, The Antiquity of the Jews, Book 20. Yet Josephus's second reference here falls both because it is dependent upon the earlier false reference for explanation and because it actually refers to Jesus, the son of Damnaeus, high priest, Justus of Tiberias. I have read the chronology of Justus of Tiberias, and being under the Jewish prejudices, as indeed he was himself a Jew by birth, he makes not one mention of Jesus, of what happened to him, or of the wonderful works that he did. So wrote Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople, 9th century. Justus was also an historian, a rival to Josephus, and from the same region. Perhaps his work was not as easily doctored. His histories did not make it through the Christian Dark Ages and are, as they say, lost to us. Pliny the Younger, 61 to 105 AD. Around the year 112, in correspondence between Emperor Trajan and the provincial governor of Pontus Bithynia, Pliny the Younger, reference is made to Christians for the first time. Pliny famously reports to the emperor, Christians asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault being that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft or adultery, falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. Pliny to Trajan, letter 10. Notice that Pliny is relaying what the arrested said they believed, and there is no reference here to a Jesus. Pliny had convened trials of Christians not because of their beliefs, but because he had forbidden political associations, which he obviously suspected them of forming. He continues, accordingly I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved excessive superstition. Some of the arrested recanted, worshipped the imperial image and state gods, and cursed Christ. But Pliny is uncertain how to proceed with numerous others in what he describes as a widespread contagion, and asks Trajan for guidance. Trajan's celebrated reply is, they are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished, but with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is by worshipping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. The real value of this correspondence, the only example of its kind to survive the Christian Dark Ages, is not that it is some proof of Jesus' existence, which it manifestly is not, but evidence of the toleration of Roman jurisprudence in the golden age of the empire. Says Trajan, but anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age. Compare this ruling of the pagan Trajan in 113 AD with that of the Christian inquisitors 13 centuries later, for whom anonymous accusations and seeking out of heretics was the modus operandi. Gaius Suetonius, 69 to 140 AD. Gaius Suetonius. Nowhere in any of Suetonius's writing does he mention Jesus of Nazareth. Suetonius did write a biography called 12 Caesars around the year 112, and the Emperor Claudius, he says, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Jesus in Rome in 54 AD? Of course not. But the unwary can be misled by this reference. Chrestus does not equate to Christ in English, but to the good in Greek. It was a name used by both slaves and free men, and is attested more than 80 times in Latin inscriptions. Clearly, Suetonius was explaining why the Jews, not Christians, were expelled from Rome, as is referring to a Jewish agitator in the 50s, not to a Galilean pacifist of the 30s. It is also said that Suetonius, in his Life of Nero, described Nero's persecution of the Christians. Punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. 16.2. We have moved from rebellious Jews to mischievous Christians. But wait a minute. Christians in Rome during the reign of Nero, 54 to 68? Could Nero have made such a fine sectarian distinction, particularly since there was no identifying faith document, not a single gospel had been written? So just what would Christians have believed? Even St. Paul himself makes not a single reference to Christians in any of his writings. The idea that a nascent Christianity immediately faced persecution from a cruel and bloodthirsty pagan Rome is an utter nonsense. For one thing, it is only in the last third of the 1st century AD that Christ followers emerged as a separate faction from mainstream Judaism. Until then, they remained protected under Roman law as Jews. The irritation they caused to their more orthodox brethren meant nothing to pagan magistrates. Says Gibbon, the innocence of the first Christians was protected by ignorance and contempt, and the tribunal of the pagan magistrate often proved the most assured refuge against the fury of the synagogue. Early Christ followers called themselves saints, brethren, brothers of the Lord, and their critics used various names: Nazareans, Ebionites, God-fearers, atheists. The Jewish association remained strong throughout the 1st century, and when Christian sects got going in Rome in the 2nd century, they were identified by their rival leaders, Valentinians, Marcionites, etc. So little were Christ worshippers known in the Roman world that as late as the 90s, Dio Cassio refers to atheists and those adopting Jewish manners. Christians as a distinct group from the Jews appear only late in the 1st century, not long before the Jewish curse on heretics at the Council of Jamnia around 85 AD. The label Christian itself only appears with the 2nd century Acts, with the story that the term began in Antioch. Equally odd is that Suetonius' isolated sentence appears in a section on Nero's good points. It should also be noted that Suetonius does not associate punishment of the Christians with the fire that swept Rome, a crucial part of the later myth. Quite simply, the reference is a Christian forgery, added to Suetonius to back up the work of the 5th century forger Sulpicius Severus, who heavily doctored the work of another Roman historian, Tacitus, with a lurid tale of brutal persecution, torched Christian martyrs, which immortalised Nero as the first Antichrist in the eyes of the Christian Church, the second Antichrist being the reformer Luther. Cornelius Tacitus, 55 to 117 AD. Christianity has no part in Tacitus' history of the Caesars, except for one questionable reference in the Annals. He recalls nothing of a cult marginal even in his own day. Sometime after AD 117, the Roman historian apparently wrote, Nero looked around for a scapegoat and inflicted the most fiendish tortures on a group of persons already hated for their crimes. This was a sect known as Christians. Their founder, one Christus, had been put to death by the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. This checked the abominable superstition for a while, but it broke out again and spread not merely through Judea, where it originated, but even to Rome itself, the great reservoir and collecting ground for every kind of depravity and filth. Those who confessed to being Christians were at once arrested, but on their testimony a great crowd of people were convicted, not so much as on the charge of arson, but of hatred of the entire human race. As we have seen, the term Christian was not in use during the reign of Nero, and there would not have been a great crowd unless we are speaking of Jews, not Christians. Jewish Christians being perceived by Roman authorities and the populace at large simply as Jews meant that early Christ followers also got caught up in the general attacks upon Jews. Says Gibbon, their effects to dissemble their Jewish origins were detected by the decisive test of circumcision, nor were the Roman magistrates at leisure to inquire into the difference of their religious tenets. One consequence of the fire which destroyed much of Rome in 64 AD was a capitation tax levied on the Jews, and it was the Jews throughout the empire who were required to pay for the city's rebuilding, a factor which helped to radicalise many Jews in the late 60s AD. Not for the first time would Christian scribes expropriate the real suffering of a whole people to create an heroic origins fable. No Christian apologists for centuries ever quoted the passage of Tacitus, not in fact until it had appeared almost word for word in the writings of Sulpicius Severus in the early 5th century, where it mixed in with other myths. Sulpicius' contemporaries credited him with a skill in the antique hand. He put it to good use, and fantasy was his forte. His Life of St. Martin is replete with numerous miracles, including raising of the dead and personal appearances of Jesus and Satan. His dastardly story of Nero was embellished during the Renaissance into a remarkable tale with Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Nero took advantage of the destruction to build his golden house, though no serious scholar believes any more that he started the fire. We now know Nero was in his hometown of Antium, Anzio, when the blaze started. Indeed, Nero opened his palace garden for temporary shelter to those made homeless. In short, the passage in Tacitus is a fraud and adds no evidence for an historical Jesus. Gibbon on Tacitus. Gibbon does not press the idea that the celebrated passage in Tacitus is a later interpolation, but he certainly rejects the idea that Christians could have been identified as a group distinct from Jews at so early a date. Gibbon suggests that Tacitus, who was writing during the reign of Hadrian, conflates the early 1st century bandit followers of Judas the Gaulonite, known as Nazarenes, with the Christians of his own time, who were also known as Nazarenes. The tax revolt of Judas the Gaulonite, aka Judas of Gamala, Judas of Galilee, is described by Josephus in Antiquity of the Jews 18. It occurred during the governorship of Sulpicius Quirinius, aka Cyrenius in Luke, in 66-7 AD. Moreover, he suggests the Jewish moderates might themselves have fingered the extremists in order to direct popular anger away from themselves. Did the rabbis know Jesus? In the most ironic twist, Christian apologists sometimes bring forward an ancient anti-Jesus slur circulated by the rabbis as evidence that their God-man existed. Yet the earliest rabbinic writings, for example the Mishnah, of which the Talmuds are later commentaries, makes no reference to a Jesus character at all. In the vast corpus of material, the closest we get is Mishnah Yemamot 4:13, which was a very oblique reference to a Peloni, Rabbinic Hebrew for so-and-so, but nothing more. Simeon ben Azai has said, I found in Jerusalem a book of genealogies, wherein was written, so-and-so is a bastard son of a married woman. The reference could have been to anyone. Though difficult to date, the verse could be a rabbinic counterstroke to Matthew's manufacture of a genealogy for Jesus early in the 2nd century. A later 2nd or 3rd century rabbinical reference is to a magician who led some Jews into apostasy. This is an addendum to the Mishnah Baratha Sanhedrin 43a, which records the hanging of a Yeshua on the eve of Passover for sorcery. It also adds that he had 5 disciples, Mattai, Kawai, Netzah, Buni and Toda, not exactly the familiar names. The 3rd century Tosefta, another supplementary commentary on the oral law, even later than the Mishnah, tells of an attempt to invoke the name of Yeshua ben Pandira to cure a rabbi of a snake bite, Tulin 2:23. Later still, the reference to Yeshua gets more colourful. Both Talmuds are late constructions. The Jerusalem Talmud was compiled in the 5th century AD, and the Talmud of Babylon was compiled during the 6th century AD. By this date, the only source of information about Jesus available to the rabbis was the Christians themselves. But far from confirming anything found in the Gospels, the rabbinic authors appear to have confounded at least 2 Jesuses, a 1st century BC Yeshua ben Pandira and a 2nd century Yeshua ben Strada. According to Talmud Shabbat 104b, Sanhedrin 67a, Jesus is apparently the son of an adulterous hairdresser, Miriam Magdala, and is executed in Lud. Talmud Sanhedrin 107b, Sota 47a, has the magician Jesus worshipping a brick during the 1st century BC reign of John Hyrcanus. If the 3rd century church father Origen is to be believed, Celsus, the pagan opponent of Christianity, writing in the late 2nd century, had heard from Jewish sources the scandalous rumour that the Christian hero was a result of an illicit affair between Miriam, a young Jewess, and a Roman trooper called Pantherus. The woman had been driven off by her husband when he discovered she had got herself pregnant by a soldier of the occupying power. One could hardly conceive of a more disreputable pedigree for a would-be Messiah, which of course reveals the whole point of the slur. To damn the iconic figure held high by apostate Jews who, together with their Gentile converts, had now formed the rival Christians, in comparison, denying that the hero figure existed would have appeared weak and conveyed none of the scurrilous insult of a bastardized racial impurity. The rabbis responded to a fable with a lie of their own. The rumour probably originated among the rabbis shortly after the Christians invented their nativity story in the late 130s. But they date the calendar? One smiles at the suggestion that a proof of Jesus is to be found in the conventional calendar, dating from the supposed birth of Christ. As any schoolchild should know, our present calendar originated in the 6th century with a monk in the service of Pope John I, Dionysius Exiguus, or Dennis the Little. At a time when bilingualism was fast disappearing, this monk from the Balkans translated the decrees of various church councils from Greek into Latin, in the process formulating canon law in the West. Pope John 523-526, anxious to free Rome from arcane missives from Constantinople, set Dionysius the task of computing future dates at Easter. Dennis decided he could not base his calculations on the then prevailing dating system, from the ascension of the great persecutor, the Emperor Diocletian, so he went back to the foundation of Rome. Working forward, he got to the years 753-754 for Jesus' birth, and deciding that the most important event made it year 1. Earlier years became Antichristum, later years of the Lord, or Anno Domini. Dennis' system had no year 0, because 0 was unknown until Arabs introduced the concept from India centuries later. Dennis had to fudge the period between December the 25th, the birthday of Mithras, inherited by Jesus a century earlier, and January the 1st, the beginning of the Roman year. He also made an error in his calculation of 753 years. 749 would have been nearer the mark. Though in truth the birth of a fictional character could have been placed in any day, month or year. The Eastern Church, for example, chose January the 6th. The Coptic Church still uses Anni Diocletii. Between the 7th and 14th centuries, then this system spread across Christendom.